Hi, everybody. Welcome to our ADA compliance webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Today, we are digging into the Americans with Disabilities Act and its requirements, specifically in regards to drinking fountains. So keep in mind, as I move through the presentation, that the requirements that I'm going to cover for you are apply to much more than just drinking fountains, baby changing tables, telephones, so many other things, but we're going to use fountains as the primary examples throughout the presentation. Okay. Now also consider that you have your own state and local laws to adhere to, so ensure that those are taken into consideration. State and local laws must be more strict than what is currently in place at the federal level, which is what we're covering today, is the federal standard for compliance. Okay. My name is Justin Dunn. I am the Senior Field Marketing Specialist over here at Haas, and a bit of a specialist in the ADA ANSI standards as they apply to fountains and eye washes and safety showers and our products as a whole. With me, Hayden, if you'd like to hop on and say hi.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. My name is Hayden Delgado. I'm a specification manager, and I've been with Haas for about 5 years now.
And then with that out of the way, so you know whose voices are coming from the other side of your monitor, make sure that if you have questions, ask those questions. Okay, use the question section on your control panel. Hayden's going to be answering those questions for about half the webinar before I turn it over to him. I'm going to cover the nitty-gritty stuff. Hayden's going to cover some examples later, and then we'll both close with some Q&A type stuff. But if you have questions, ask them. If we can't get to those questions and answer them during the presentation, we'll do a follow-up and get you the questions, the answers with those answers that you asked, the on-demand recording, presentation slides, a PDF of the slides, some additional support materials. We'll give you CEU instructions on how to contact us and work with us to get that CEU credit, and then of course the Q&A. So expect that about 24 to 48 hours after the presentation. Give us a little time. We want to make sure we get all those resources together, and we'll send it off to you. Now, real quick, I'm going to give you a quick history lesson on Haas. We'll talk about the agenda. Then we'll talk about the history, real quick history of the ADA legislation, and then get into the meat of the presentation, okay? But first, it's really important to us to help you understand why we think we are so well positioned to present this type of material, okay? Now, our founder was Luther Haas. He invented the world's first sanitary drinking fountain bubbler head in 1906 amidst movements like ban the cup and so on, and formed the Haas Sanitary Drinking Fountain Company in 1909. That was in Berkeley, California. Luther was working as a sanitation inspector for Berkeley when he had the thought to invent a device that would prevent users from spreading germs and disease through public hydration. And that device was the drinking fountain bubbler head. So you see, pre-Luther and his invention, it was commonplace to see public fountains with constant running water, which isn't so uncommon in the rest of the world. That's still a common practice in some places, but attached or anchored to that fountain would be a cup of various different makes and types. But that cup, you would pick it up, you would have a drink, and you would drop the cup, and the next person would use it, and that is the source of the problem, is mouth touching cup, cup touching the next person's mouth, and we have a serious issue, public sanitation issue. Some of the common diseases at the time were cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, all of which potentially fatal and spread from mouth to cup to mouth. It wasn't just you know, I mean, these were serious, potentially life-threatening diseases. So lucky for us, Luther put his inventive mind to the task, found a solution that has greatly and continuously benefited public health and safety to this day. And that first prototype that he made the bubbler head out of was actually his bedpost, a brass bedpost, which I think is a fun bit of trivia. Today, Haas is located in Sparks, Nevada, where we work tirelessly to improve the health and safety of our global community. Now for our agenda real quick, overview of the ADA legislation. Okay, we're going to cover all of it. Common ADA installation issues, some of the more serious issues, the ones we find out in the wild, because we want you to have some insight into what's happening out there that is the issue. Hygienic hydration solutions, and then we'll close with the Q&A and get those answered and give you some additional information before we close. Now, for the other bit of history as far as the ADA goes, okay? Now, first and foremost, before we get into the meat of it, that it's important to remember that this is civil rights legislation. And not just that, but the ADA legislation was the first major legislation to treat disability rights as a civil rights issue. Prior to the standard, its inception and its inception, accessibility was up to the business owner, individuals, and was infrequently available. Okay, people didn't want to spend the money to update their businesses and thought that your handicap was your problem, and there were no teeth in any requirements to provide access to buildings and grounds for an entire class of people that were being very heavily neglected. But thanks to people like Justin Dart, former head of Dart Industries, a company responsible for such brands as Duracell, Tupperware, eventually merging with Kraft. I'm sure you know Kraft. He was one of the biggest advocates for the movement and is often referred to as the father or grandfather of the ADA. He was himself was disabled. That's him in several of the photos with the hat. And alongside fellow advocates such as Mr. George H.W. Bush, who was the sitting president that signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26, 1990. This new act granted reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and prohibited discrimination based on those disabilities. It's a very cool story if you look it up. And it would be hard to believe now, but they were met with incredibly strong resistance to these proposed changes. And Dart went on to found the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities to combat pushes to weaken the ADA from advocates that would surprise you. Like, seriously, names and celebrities that would seriously surprise you. There were protests and counter protests, and they had demonstrations like the Capitol Crawl, where they had about 60 demonstrators. They abandoned their wheelchairs and walking devices, assisted devices, and crawled up the steps of the Capitol to show its inaccessibility. And once they reached the top, demanded to speak with the Speaker of the House. Actually, that's Jennifer Keelan there in the photo, crawling up the steps. She was 8 years old. A cerebral palsy was affecting her for most of her life, and still does today. She still advocates and speaks about her involvement in the movement, and has actually a great kids book called All the Way to the Top. But in another instance, while protesting the Transportation Association, the police showed up, which is, I think, one of my favorite stories, and to arrest the protesters, but in a very funny and very ironic twist, didn't have accessible paddy wagons and had to obtain accessible school buses just to transport them into custody. The Public Transit Authority was actually one of the groups that was they fought hardest against the regulations for accessibility. But as you can see here, with fresh ink on paper, needed to seal the deal. This is a photo of HW signing the bill into law alongside Evan Kemp, chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Justin Dart, as I mentioned before. Bush even added a nice note to the famous photo, thanking Mr. Dart for his efforts. And that does it. That does it for the history lesson, but I always think it's important to remind people where where this started, why this is important, and so on. So with that, we're going to ask a series of poll questions throughout the presentation. There's only a series, that sounds like so many, but a couple of poll questions. And the first is going to be right now. Hayden, if you would launch that, please.
Our first poll question today is, what are you looking to obtain from this webinar? And for this one, you can please select all that apply to you. So as many as apply to you as possible. And the options are basic ADA compliance guidance, product recommendations, touchless or hygienic solutions, and then CEU credits. And for all these poll questions, we'll go through what the question is, what the answer options are, and the type of answer options. And then I'll just give everybody a few extra seconds as we continue to see responses come in before closing those poll questions out. I still see some responses coming in, so just a little while longer. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and start closing it out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And we always think poll questions help to break up the information and get you involved, and it helps us to keep improving this. So thank you for that. So let's get into it. So Americans with Disabilities Act 28 CFR Part 36 Title 3 regarding public accommodations and commercial facilities and its requirements are enforced by none other than the Department of Justice. Title 3 is going to be our entire focus today. The following are the key sections of the standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. Also remember that Hayden is going to send out the slides to everyone after the presentation so you can reference them later. And quickly, since I always get asked, Title II covers state and local government. Title I is more to do with anti-discrimination for disabled employees. Also remember, we'll bring it up a little bit later, but this is based on ANSI I-117.1 standard, and it protects persons well beyond those with an inability or difficulty walking. So sensory impairment, extremes of physical size, reaching, manipulation disabilities are just, those are just some of the disabilities that this legislation helps to protect. And the goal of all of it is universal access and design, and you'll see that as we're moving through this presentation. So let's kick off by talking about section 36.403, which gives us a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility in a facility. And you're going to notice that in this list, drinking fountains takes a pretty high priority, even over accessible parking. The entrance, the route, restrooms, public telephones, fountains, as well as parking, storage, alarms are all high priority items. Basic human necessities when navigating the world. All walks of life, all people everywhere need water. That's the basics. It's right at the top of the list of things we need to survive. So we need to ensure that it is accessible to everyone. Now, Chapter 1, Section 102 just lets us know that this document contains both adult and children's height requirements for fountains and other elements based on average human anthropometrics, which is just measurements and capabilities of the human body. So children are defined as age 12 or younger in the ADA. Now, Chapter 2 explains that where there's one fountain, typically a high side fountain, that there must be 2 fountains. Okay, local building codes determine the number of drinking fountains that must be installed based on occupancy. This simply states that there must be a high fountain and a low fountain. Okay, what most people don't understand is that the low side fountain is not the only one that's designed for people with disabilities. The high side fountain is also a disabled accessible fountain, and it's designed for those with bending or stooping disabilities that may be using a walker, cane, crutches, and may not be physically able to utilize the low side fountain. Other than aesthetics, drinking fountains are not designed for able-bodied people. It's reasonable to assume that if you're able-bodied that you can take a drink of whichever fountain you choose. So if you are installing a single fountain in your facility or in a park, you must satisfy this requirement and install a second fountain. They don't even need to be next to each other. They can be separated or on either end of a hallway, but both must be present on site so that you have the options. Now, 211.3. This is referred very simply, and a great way to remember this is the 50-50 rule. And it simply states that half of the units installed shall be high fountains and the other half shall be low fountains. So just as a quick example, if you are installing 6 new fountains in the building, you couldn't do 4 high fountains and only 2 low fountains. You have to provide 3 high and 3 low. The exception to this rule is where the number of fountains yields a fraction. Okay, so in another example, so if you had 7 fountains and above and beyond what you required, you had to have 7 fountains on site. Required 6, have 7. That fraction, that last fountain, you can do whatever you want with. So follow the 50-50 rule, but that last singular fountain, you can put it high fountain, low fountain, whichever it is that you prefer. Now in chapter 3, we start getting into dimensional and mechanical elements. I used that term earlier. You can hear me say it a lot. An element is whatever it is that we're giving access to. This can be a drinking fountain, phone, fire extinguisher, baby changing table, etc. Many of the measurements that we're going to cover obviously apply to a lot more than just the fountains. Now this is one of the most important measurements to remember, and very frequently the section that's being violated in tear outs and reinstalls. 305.3 and 305.5 detail clear ground space to accommodate the wheelchair, the device, underneath the fountain, allowing an approach that's unobstructed to the fountain. Okay, you have to provide a 30-inch by 48-inch space of clear space underneath the element, okay, which is just larger than your typical adult-sized wheelchair, giving them plenty of space underneath the unit to maneuver both their hands and the device underneath the fountain or whatever the element is. And this is an example. This just clearly demonstrates the clear ground space in front of the element. Okay, in this case, you've got a telephone and a fire extinguisher. 305.5 just explains the positioning of this clear ground space, allowing for either a forward approach, like you see on the left, or a parallel approach, like you see on the right. Both are very important for different circumstances, okay, and for different disabilities. So just depending on what the site is accommodating and so on, or certainly from children or adult perspective, both approaches are very important for different situations. Now remember that all of these measurements are bare minimum requirements, okay? The more space you can provide, the better. When the element is in an alcove, like in the examples, wheelchair users are going to need additional space to maneuver, but not just wheelchairs, other devices as well. And the clear floor space changes based on both the depth of the alcove and the type of approach. So in our first example, we have a 30 by 48-inch area, and that becomes 36 by 48 inches when the depth of that alcove exceeds 24 inches in the second example. For a parallel approach, when the depth of the alcove exceeds 15 inches, then our clear floor space must be 30 by 60 inches. Okay, more and more states are requiring this in the use of alcoves, and it's important that we add that extra space, especially when we're moving into an alcove, which could be a little more difficult. Now, extending up from that clear ground space we just defined is our toe and our knee clearance. So try to think of the clear area as a 3-dimensional space. Okay, our toe clearance is 9 inches from the ground to the bottom of the element, and our knee clearance is 27 inches from the ground up to the bottom of the element or device. Now, obstructions in this yellow highlighted area are very frequently a common compliance issue. Okay, and we've got some great examples coming up that we have found, but this space underneath must be clear, and that can include things like P-traps. But it's a little dated if you want to know how old I am, but hanging phone books or anything else that you might be able to think of in that space. That space is unusable. Okay, which is going to bring us to poll question number 2.
The second poll question today is, how important is filtered water to you and or your clients? Again, you can select as many as apply to you as possible, and the options are extremely important, very important, somewhat important, not at all important, or not sure. And for those of you that attend our ADA webinar often, you'll probably notice that a few of our poll questions have been changed for today. That's a part of why we like all the participants that we get in the poll questions. We get to see how we can change things up going forward, as Justin hit on earlier in that last poll question. So thank you for everybody for the participation.
We do have a handful of you every single time that are repeat ADA webinar attendees, and we appreciate you. Glad you like this content so much. You just keep on coming back. I love it.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this one out. Back to you, Justin.
Okay, moving on. So 307, this covers protruding objects. Okay, this is very important. Protruding objects, this is primarily in place to protect another type of protected class, okay, that we just barely touched on, and that class is the visually impaired or sensory impaired folks. Elements may only protrude into a walkway so much and have to be located at certain heights, whether they're in an alcove or not, okay? Doesn't matter. So this is to prevent anyone with a complete or partial loss of sight from running into those elements. Objects with their leading edge, which is the lowest point on the front of the element, okay? Those above 27 inches, that leading edge above 27 inches may only protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel, but so long as that leading edge of the element is at or underneath 27 inches, then this is considered to be detectable by detection cane, according to the Department of Justice. Now, in this example, this is one of my favorite illustrations here that I stole. We've got our visually impaired buddy here navigating a hallway. On the bottom right, we see an object very similar in some ways to a drinking fountain. And so long as its leading edge is at or below that 27-inch line that's going across there, that element can be detected through the use of a detection cane, and early enough to be avoided and helped prevent potential injury in this navigation. So this fountain and any element, so long as it's meeting the 27-inch requirement, can protrude any amount into this space because it's detectable. Now the same rule applies for elements at or above 80 inches from the floor. Okay, that's called headroom clearance. And similar to the previous example, can extend any amount into the space as we like. Now on the left, we have the opposite of both examples. So we have an object that is sitting above 27 inches and below 80 inches, smack dab in the middle, and therefore may not protrude into the space any more than 4 inches, unless there's one exception, and that's a handrail. Handrails are allowed to protrude an extra ½ inch as part of that exception, but that is it. No other exceptions. Now, I'm going to use our products as an example here. Our 1011 HPS is on the screen. The SK3 cane skirt is what is attached there, and that's what I want to focus on. So this is like your typical high-low unit installed in your high traffic, like customer areas, etc. Like it's shiny and it looks great. And it's your typical example of what a high-low ADA installation looks like. So the SK3 cane skirt there is what we need to discuss. So where drinking fountains cannot be alcoved out of the path of travel, or your state doesn't require it, you need to use a cane skirt device to lower the leading edge of the high side fountain to 27 inches on the other side, right? Our low side fountain is already sitting at 27 inches. If we have a high-low unit next to each other, we need this device to lower that edge so it is detectable from both directions, okay? So we don't have any collisions with this type of equipment. Now, Section 308 brings us to reach range requirements. Another important consideration when something like a bottle filler is installed, or when things like baby changing tables are put in place. The slide is pretty straightforward, I think. You could all diagnose this pretty easy, but if your reach is unobstructed, like in the photo on the left, then you have a high 48-inch max reach range and a 15-inch minimum reach range, all based on just average human anthropometrics. Now, any buttons, handles, sensors, etc., have to be located within this range, okay, for activation of whatever this is. But as soon as we introduce an obstruction, our reach ranges are diminished, right? So when an object shorter than 20 inches is in place, we keep our 48-inch high reach range, but our lower reach range is gone. It disappears because we have a fountain or another element in its place. Now, when reaching over an object that is 20 to 25 inches, not typically a fountain, those are other types of elements. Fountains are usually 20 inches or shorter. Our reach range is shortened to 44 inches, okay? Because we're reaching over something, we're leaning, we have further to go. So our reach range is diminished, and obviously we don't have a lower reach range. So generally speaking, again, drinking fountains are shorter than 20 inches. So the middle example would be what our reach ranges are going to be for that type of device. Now the DOJ advisory here defines reach ranges for children, and it's based on age. So remember, children are defined as age 12 and under in the ADA. These are all reach ranges that apply to both forward and parallel approach to an element. So starting on the left, obviously as they grow, because kids grow like weeds, their arm reach grows as well, extending their reach. So ages over 12 are expected to utilize adult height drinking fountains. They're about that age and size. They're okay to kind of navigate and use that equipment as they wish. The only places you'll typically find children's fountains in use is like school systems, daycare facilities, facilities where many children are supervised by fewer adults. That's where you're going to run into these. Now in public, the expectation is that an adult is present to assist children with using fountains and bottle fillers and things like that. So there's public assistance for those types of situations from a parent or guardian. Now in chapter 6, we get into the specifics regarding plumbing elements and their measurements. So first off, 602.2 covers clear floor space and the necessity to have that clear floor space centered on the unit, not on the alcove, not on between the wing walls, whatever it is that you're building or you're looking at, but centered on the element itself. So this is for a forward approach, as a parallel approach needs to be set up differently. Obviously our toe and knee clearance must also still be available. There is an exception included here for parallel approaches to children's use units, allowing for a parallel approach, so long as the bubbler or spout, wherever the exit of the water is for a fountain, is at a certain height and depth. Knee and toe clearance begins to diminish pretty quickly as we lower fountains for children's use. So the use of a parallel approach is incredibly important, especially considering that children's use wheelchairs can vary wildly in size and can even be adult wheelchairs. Custom sized wheelchairs can get expensive. And they can be pretty quickly outgrown too. So a parallel approach can often help to solve this issue. Now, this is a great illustration showing that floor space centered on the elements themselves And as far as the fountain goes, since the clear floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it's centered on the left low side fountain. And since there's no real floor space defined in black and white for the high side, the floor space can spill over under the high side fountain as much as is needed. Okay, and generally you have one person using one of these. If there's two, you know, they may need to wait, especially if there's a wheelchair sitting there. But many make the mistake of centering the clear floor space on the alcove, which leads to expensive tearouts and redesigns. And while there isn't a space defined in black and white for that high side fountain, there is a generally agreed upon number based on walker size and things like that for the high side as well, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. Now here, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna just try to confuse you as best I can. So here you can see we have a total width 48 inches in the alcove, wall to wall. It isn't deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand our 30-inch clear floor space. Remember, we need more space the deeper the alcove gets. You will notice that it shows a separate measurement for California. Now, California has got above and beyond the standards and mandated an additional 2 inches of floor space, bumping up the width of the floor space to 32 inches. So long as the state requirements again go above and beyond the federal standards, they can supersede them. Centering the fountain is not mandatory. Okay, lock that in. So it looks better, and it does make the installation more aesthetically pleasing, but it is not required to be centered in any way in that alcove. Okay. Now, if the alcove was deeper than 24 inches, remember that we would need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance to allow for more maneuverability on a forward approach. For California, we have our 32 inches and 30 inches everywhere else centered on the low side fountain. So center line to center line, these fountains are separated by 16 inches, which means we need an additional 16 inches on either side of the fountains from center line, from the center line total to meet our 32-inch minimum for California, and a slightly smaller space for everywhere else. So since there are no obstructions under the high side fountain, our primary concern is the wall. Remember, if it is at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned, or the fountain would need to be shoved over so that the high side fountain is closer to the alcove wall, giving us our clear floor space under the fountain. Okay, so doing so, it'll leave the unit a little off center, but we should remember that the high side is also for those with disabilities. Okay, and they may be using those walkers, crutches, canes, and they need to access it too. Okay, and then that brings us to poll question number 3.
The third poll question today is, how important is it that the drinking fountain or bottle fillers disperse chilled water? And the options for this are extremely important, very important, somewhat important, not at all important, and not sure.
So real quick, while you're doing that, I am going to turn control over to Hayden so that he can progress the slides, because he's going to do the next portion with examples and things like that for you. And then I'll jump back in towards the end here. So let me turn that over. And you should be good.
And I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll question. There we go. Now I can adjust the slides. So here we have an excerpt from the California Building Code, and this made it mandatory to locate all of our drinking fountains in an alcove or with wing walls. And California is not the only state to do this. We've seen it in other states as well, such as Texas, Georgia, and Connecticut. And where these areas are installed, they must be 32 inches wide by at least 18 inches deep. So very similar to that example that Justin showed us on that slide before that last poll question. And where we cannot install an alcove, we would need to put in place wing walls. And our wing walls would have to project out horizontally, at least as far as the leading edge of our drinking fountain, and to within 6 inches of the ground in order to be detected by a cane. And these are ideal to make sure that our drinking fountains are not protruding into the path of travel and obstructing our walkways in any way. Here we have a ADA installation issue. This is a drinking fountain that we found out in the wild, as Justin likes to say. It was at a local school, and our clear floor space is obstructed, making this non-compliant. We have what we're told is a gas valve under that low side drinking fountain, and it's obstructing our toe and knee clearance and our clear floor space under that unit. And we would have to do a tear out and a redesign in order to make this compliant. There may actually be a pretty simple fix depending on the dimensions of this alcove. We may be able to just swap the heights of these two fountains. If we moved our lower fountain to the left and kept it at that wheelchair accessible height, move that high side fountain to the right, as long as we still have clear floor space on the left under that low side unit, and then we can have that gas valve under our high side unit because we do not need clear floor space under it. Here, we're going to go back and revisit section 602.2, talking about children's use, and it does give us dimensions for those child height elements. It tells us that our bubbler head spout can be at a maximum of 30 inches and 3.5 inches maximum depth. So that's where the bubbler head is at in the drinking fountain. It cannot be more than 3.5 inches from that leading edge. And it does allow us to forego that 27 inches of knee and toe clearance, because when we're lowering these units down, it's going to be diminishing that toe and knee clearance under the unit. But many state and local building authorities do not allow for a parallel approach. You need to check your local codes for this, as some may even specify specifics on toe and knee clearance for child height elements and child height drinking fountains in particular. And then here we have another ADA installation issue. This one's pretty interesting. We have two high lows installed in an alcove, but our low side unit on the left is installed too close to the wall. We would not have enough room for our 30 by 48 inches of clear floor space centered under that unit. We also have a bottle filler installed on our high unit and outside of our reach range. So we would need to move that bottle filler to one of our low side units. And the unit on the right, that high-low, is actually compliant. Everything is good with that. So if we wanted to just tear out that unit on the left, we could, and leave the high-low unit on the right, and it would be a compliant alcove. If we needed all four of these fountains to meet our minimum requirements, then we would need to swap the heights of that high-low on the left-hand side, putting that high side closer to the wall and our low side in the middle, making sure we have clear floor space for all of our units, and then also moving that bottle filler to one of our low side units like shown here on the slide. We have another example here. This would need to be torn out and redesigned. It's a great idea. We see the cascading design in a lot of places, especially when we have a child height unit and a high-low. However, this one was just done a little out of order. If we wanted to keep it in ascending order like this, we would need to swap around the order of these units and the heights of them as well. The reason for that is our high-low unit, which is meant for wheelchair accessibility and standing or stooping disabilities accessibility, is installed actually at a child height and then a wheelchair height in this example. We would need to change that and install them so that we have our clear floor space under that wheelchair unit. So if we wanted to keep that cascading design, we would take that standalone standalone drinking fountain on the right-hand side, move it all the way to the left and drop it down to a child height, and then move our high-low unit up and to the right, putting that wheelchair accessible unit in the center and our high side unit on the right, and making sure that we have clear floor space. If we left it like this, anybody that was trying to access that center unit with a wheelchair would be bumping into that unit on the right hand or on the left hand side and not able to access it. So in order to show how to do that compliantly, I'm going to use a few Haas models and give some dimensions so you can go back and reference it. So we're going to be using the Haas 1501 wide enamel high-low drinking fountain and the Haas 1311 wide enamel standalone drinking fountain. And the dimensions to install that properly, keeping that cascading design, that very aesthetically pleasing design that we see out there very often, would be as seen here. We have our child height fountain installed at the proper height. It's at 30 inches maximum for that bubbler head from the floor. We have 27 inches for our knee clearance under our wheelchair accessible unit, that low side unit in the high low there in the center. And then we have 22 inches from that wheelchair accessible unit to our child height unit. That's center line to center line. And that's going to give us enough space, as I'll show on the next slide, for our knee clearance and our wheelchair accessibility, that clear floor space. And then as typical with high-low units, we have 16 inches between that high and low unit, center line to center line. So that 22 inches from the center line of the wheelchair accessible unit to that child height unit gives us 15 inches from the center line to the leading edge of that child height unit. That would give us 30 inches centered under that unit of clear floor space. As Justin talked about, our clear floor space can flood under that high side unit since it's above our knee clearance, our knee obstruction area. And if we were in another state like California that requires 32 inches, we would have to move that child height fountain out another inch to give us 32 inches of knee clearance centered under there, or clear floor space centered under there. Here's another example of an ADA installation issue. We have a Haas 3300 FR, and it's just a simple mistake here. It's just installed a little too close to our wall there for a forward approach to this unit. As we know, the ADA requires us to have a forward approach to a drinking fountain. We cannot have a parallel approach to this unit, and we also wouldn't want the water shooting directly at anybody that's trying to use its face. So the forward approach here is obstructed. We would need to move this further away from the wall in order to be compliant. So I'm going to get into some examples similar to that last one and how to do it correctly while giving you some slides with all the dimensions to reference. And I'm going to be using our Haas 3150 model. This model has an arm that can be adjusted for either wheelchair accessibility height or a child height. We see that most often in cases of playgrounds, and it is a very common style. Most of the fountains that are this style, however, have approaches that come from different sides or different angles. As you can see here, you wouldn't be coming up to this unit in the same angle to access that high side unit as you would for the low side. So when installing them, it's important to keep in mind the style and the approach angle, and keep that in mind when we're putting it against a wall or on a concrete pad or any type of surface. So here's how we would install this correctly if we're putting it near a wall. We have 15 inches from the center line of our fountain to the wall. That gives us 30 inches of clear floor space centered under that unit. And then we also have 30 by 30 inches of clear floor space for our high side unit. We kind of touched on this earlier, but it is the generally agreed upon amount of space that we want to provide for clear floor space to that high side unit. And the reason for that is we want to make it accessible to anybody that's going to be needing the assistance of a cane or a walker to be able to access this as easy as possible. It's very often when installing these, or at least common practice, especially in public parks, to lay down a concrete pad. And it helps remove the fountains from any walkways, as well as providing a firm surface to stand on or maneuver a wheelchair. We don't want to have to make anybody maneuver a wheelchair on grass or dirt. We want to make it, again, as easy as possible. And in this case, we have a path of travel that's on the left-hand side, and we have a front approach with that 30 by 48 inches of clear floor space to our low side unit, and then our 30 by 30 inches of clear floor space to the high side unit. And that would give us a minimum concrete pad or flat surface of 69 inches wide by 52 inches. with that low side facing the path of travel as well, so that a wheelchair can get in there easily. Now, if we wanted to add wing walls to that unit, all the requirements would remain the same, still favoring a forward approach, but the guardrails are going to have to extend out at least as far as the leading edge of that drinking fountain to keep it out of our path of travel and to make it detectable by anybody walking through there. And we still need to keep all of our clear floor space with 54 inches of width there. So here's a quick lineup of some Haas outdoor models with different ways and styles to meet ADA accessibility. We have all different types of options and accessories for these types of units to meet the style or the finish that you want and what you need to meet ADA accessibility in your site or your facility. And now getting back into the legislation just really quickly before we move on to a few more examples. In 2010, the 2010 ADA standards for accessibility design come from the ANSI standard. And in 2017, a revision, the A117.1-2017 was published. Now, one of the updates in that revision was the addition of bottle filling stations to the section 602 heading of drinking fountains. Now, the key word there is addition. Bottle filling stations cannot replace a drinking fountain. You still need to have your minimum number of drinking fountains in your facility, and then you can add bottle filling stations as a bonus on top of that. You would also need to add a bottle filling station to our low side unit if you're going to add it to a high-low drinking fountain. The reason for that is we need it within our reach ranges, and it must also be front approach and with that same amount of clear floor space as we see for our typical wheelchair accessibility units. You can also add a standalone bottle filler if you would like, and those can have a forward or parallel approach, so a little bit different than our typical drinking fountain clear floor space. You can have a parallel approach for a standalone bottle filling station, and the controls would have to be hand operated or automatic. That is a question that we actually got twice already today during the webinar, as I've been looking at the back end. The operation for those, there is a requirement. It has to be hand operated or automatic. And also, as I talked about, you can add bottle filling stations once you meet the minimum number of drinking fountains you have. You can also add a bottle filling station to the high side of a fountain once you meet that minimum requirement of installing the bottle filling station on that low side unit. So to get into some examples of bottle filling stations in the requirements form, I'm going to be using the Haas 1920 series. Big reason why we use these is we see them very often out in public because they can be installed on a new unit or even retrofitted over existing units. You can also get one as a standalone if you would like as well. And they have different options like white enamel or stainless steel. We have push buttons, touchless operated, and they can retrofit over Haas and a good majority of other manufacturers' drinking fountains that have already been installed. So here we have a 1920 touchless bottle filler installed above a 1117 LNHO2 touchless drinking fountain, and it's accessible to everyone and well within our reach ranges. It's on that low side fountain, and we have a automatic operation for that bottle filler. We also have our first example with the bottle filler rest here. Justin's going to talk to these a little bit more as we get towards the end of the webinar. But bottle filler stands are a great addition to help anybody with a prosthetic limb or somebody that's maneuvering a wheelchair. It just allows for one-handed operation. So as I said, we do need to ensure that that activation is within our reach range. And here we have it at 46 inches. So we know that our maximum reach range is 48 inches. We're 2 inches below that. That's compliant. And we are only having a drinking fountain that's protruding out about 18 to 20 inches here. So our reach range is not going to drop down at all. We also have our knee clearance at 27 inches. This is a good slide to go back and reference anytime installing a bottle filler above your average high-low drinking fountain. And then back to ADA installation issues. Here we have a bottle filler. There's two things wrong with it. Number one, it's installed way too high. It's well above our 48 inches of maximum reach range, and it's also installed above the high-low unit as a whole, not above that low unit, and therefore we're going to need to tear that out. You could install it somewhere else as a standalone, or you could install a smaller bottle filler that would fit above that low side unit and within our reach range. Similar example, this time they got it half right. They installed it above our low side unit for both of these, except for the bottle filler is above our reach range again. If we had a unit more like the 1920, you could retrofit it over this unit as it is and make it within our reach ranges at 48 inches and above that low side unit still to make this compliant pretty easily. Or you would have to take this current bottle filler and install it somewhere else as a standalone bottle filler. The model 1501 that we talked about earlier, here we have a 1920W bottle filler installed over it. Again, this is a very accessible ADA setup, and it's a popular installation, especially in schools because of that white enamel, keeping everything within our reach ranges as well. Good option to go with here for anything that's white enamel. We also have it installed over that standalone 1311 drinking fountain. This could be put at a third height for children's use if you would like. If you want to add a bottle filler unit at that height, you could also install it at our wheelchair accessibility fountain height if you would like, or if you meet all your minimum requirements, you could add this as a third height fountain at our standing or stooping disabilities height. If we are installing that at a children's height, we would need to keep in mind our reach ranges and our bubbler height for those. So here we have a compliant example. We have our bubbler height at the maximum of 30 inches to that spout, and we have our button for our bottle filler at 42 5/8 inches. That's just below our maximum reach range of 44 inches for anybody that's 9 to 12. And we can go back and reference that table from the Department of Justice anytime that we're installing these, depending on the age group that we are installing them at children's height for. So whether we are installing these in a public building, an airport, a college, or even a commercial building, we want to make sure that we're providing easy access to all facilities and by all people. That is the primary goal of the ADA standards for accessible design. And hopefully the quick guide and all the slides that we've gone through so far today have helped demonstrate how the standard works, what the key parts of it are, and how to fix some of those most simple mistakes that we see very often. So to wrap things up with that portion of the presentation before we move on to the hygienic options and the Q&A, we just want to show an example of a high-low drinking fountain with a bottle filler that's compliant in Haas's own backyard. This is at the Reno Airport, just down the street from the Haas Corporation's main facility. And it shows a high-low drinking fountain that's installed compliantly in an alcove. Everything is centered. We have our clear floor space. We have our reach ranges. And if I could add it on to it, it is very aesthetically pleasing as well, how this unit is installed. So now we're going to hop back into our second to last poll question. And this poll question is, how often do you recommend, specify, or purchase a drinking fountain with a bottle filler attached? A lot of responses coming in quickly for this one. I like to see that. Thank you, everyone. The options for this, you can only select one for this question, but they are 75+% of the time, 50% to 74% of the time, 25 to 49% of the time, 1 to 24% of the time, or less than 1% of the time. Give it a few more seconds as we're seeing answers come in. I am kind of surprised. We're not seeing a large amount of them, but we are seeing some answers come in that say less than 1%. Typically, we tend to see those higher numbers on this slide. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you, everyone. So over the past few years, we have taken initiative to provide new hygienic and accessible hydration options. Obviously, that's been a big priority for a lot of manufacturers as of lately. And our options include things like our touchless sensors that we've shown on bottle fillers and drinking fountains throughout the webinar today, and antimicrobial copper push buttons or antimicrobial surfaces in general. Those include bubbler heads for some of our items as well. And we're going to get into details about those options here on this slide. So starting off on the left, we have two of our newer units in our electric water cooler series. These units are ADA compliant. The units with bubbler heads, so everything except for our standalone bottle fillers, have antimicrobial bubbler heads on those units. They also have smart features like that bottle saved counter. It's pretty standard nowadays. I think everybody wants to see how many bottles they're saving. And then we also have forward-thinking energy efficiency. You can track that filter life, calibrate the sensor that's on the units, and we also have a purge feature to prevent any Legionella growth inside those water lines. It also has an error codes display so that we don't have any flashing red lights or flashing error codes. You have to access them, and it'll give a quick solution to what's going on with these units if there is any problems. They're also very easy to install and retrofit over a majority of Haws and other competitors' units because of the abundance of extra space under those units. And they come with a self-leveling wall mount and an installation template to show you where just about every screw needs to go. Then in the middle, we have some of our standalone bottle fillers. These are also ADA compliant. And to me, they're really ideal for all different types of high traffic areas, whether it's indoor or outdoor. And they are made of stainless steel. So bonus of being vandal resistant, as well as resisting stains or any type of corrosion. And then on the right, we have the sanitary activation options for the push buttons. Those are the touchless sensors or those copper antimicrobial push buttons. The copper is a big priority for us. We saw, especially during COVID, a lot of healthcare places start utilizing copper more often because of its antimicrobial properties and how well recognized that is across many industries. So we decided why not add that as an option to our drinking fountains for the most touch surface on them. We also have those touchless sensors, and both of those can be added to new units when purchased, or they can be retrofitted over existing Haws push buttons as well.
All right, so real quick, I wanted to mention too on here, so the work is never fully complete, right? There's always small steps we can take to make equipment more accessible, to make it more universal. And so what we have here is the BTL 1001, BTL 1107, the BTL 1311. Collectively, these are capable of retrofitting our core fountains and a huge number of them. These are all over the US and the world, really. So there's lots of options to add these. These are bottle filler stands. Easily retrofittable, vandal resistant. They go on very quickly, and it gives the user an option to set down the bottle. It lessens backsplash and things like that, but you can set the bottle down, and especially if you're considering accessibility and the use of something like prosthetic limb, right? Being able to single-handedly or just having the space, if you're using multiple prosthetics, to set the bottle down, activate the bottle filler separately rather than having to hold a bottle and press, etc. It's a very simple device, but a very helpful one. Also, they look great. Just to slap our engineering team on the back. But these are a new option for us at Haws. So that brings us to poll question number 5, and then we'll wrap this up.
So our final poll question today is, would you be interested in learning more about Haws hydration solutions? Again, please select only one answer, and the options are interested in attending a product webinar, or if you are interested in scheduling a lunch and learn with us. After this poll question, once we go ahead and close it out, we will be hopping into the Q&A portion of today's webinar as well for the last few minutes, and then Justin will wrap things out before we end the webinar. Thank you for everybody that participated in our poll questions today as well.
And I think we have like a like a tight six, like we had. Hayden was informing me that we have a good amount of questions, but we're going to fly through a couple of them, give short, quick answers, and we'll close the webinar out for everybody.
All right, I will take the first question that we have. It's, do you have recommendations for disinfecting or cleaning of water fountains prior to turning them back on? So yes, this is a very common question that we got, especially towards the end of COVID. And if you have a bottle filler on those drinking fountains that was being used during the time, then you are in luck. That's probably been using or has been using the water supply line and clearing it out regularly with clean drinking water. However, there would still likely be a small portion of the supply leading to that bubbler that would need to be cleaned out. That can likely be done with just a small brush to clean the tubing in the fountain, as there may be some growth inside of there. And then for units that do not have a bottle filler, we would suggest descaling your lines and then again cleaning out the supply line before taking a drink of that unit or providing it to anybody in the public to take a drink out of. And you would probably want to do some basic cleaning of the bubbler head for those units as well. The second question that we have, Justin, if you want to take this one, it's, can we obtain a copy of the ANSI standard, and do you have a white paper?
No and yes. So you can, ANSI wants you to purchase their standards. You can go to their website, look up whatever version it is that you want, and there's a small fee, and you can get your hands on the standard. Otherwise, Haas, we do a very good job of putting together lots of resources for you for both fountain and emergency eyewash safety equipment standards, and to understand them, and they're laid out in checklists and white papers and things like that. Go to our website, haasco.com. It's got tons of resources for you.
Next question is, there are drinking fountains with options for freeze resistant. Is it possible to have a freeze resistant for dog bowls? They give an example of the model 3611 FR Haas unit. And no, Haas does not offer freeze resistant dog bowls. And that includes that 3600 series of our outdoor bottle filler and drinking fountain units. It is something that I could look into. It would really depend on how the Bury valves would work with that unit.
And there are certain we'll do specials on for freeze resistant dog bowls, but you just got to reach out to our customer service team.
And the next question is, does this course qualify for Texas 1 hour requirements for barriers, CEU for architects?
You want me to maybe. So ASPE, AIA, ABIH, IFMA, this presentation is certified through a lot of organizations, but and we will have those instructions, CEU instructions, in the follow-up email. If you do self-reporting, or if you need just an attendance certificate, we can provide that too. So all of that will be available in the follow-up materials.
And then I'll speak to our next question really quick. So the question is, we'd like some clarification on distance from walls surrounding the drinking fountains. So we covered this a lot throughout the webinar today, but the ADA requires that we provide clear floor space for that wheelchair accessible drinking fountain, and that needs to be a minimum of 30 inches wide and 48 inches in length with a forward approach, and then, as we said, also centered on that low side unit. So in order to achieve that 30 inches of width, we would need a certain amount of distance from the center of our drinking fountain, 15 inches, to the wall. That would give us that 30 inches centered under there. So if you took, for example, the Haas 1107L, that is 12 inches wide. That would mean that we would need another 9 inches from the edge of that unit to the wall to give us 15 inches from the center line to the wall, and therefore 30 inches centered under that unit. Again, though, if this is installed in an alcove, that clear floor space can expand depending on the depth of the alcove. So we would need to keep in mind how deep our alcove is for that type of unit. And then Justin, if you want to wrap things up here.
Yep. So the follow-up email, 24 to 48 hours, give us a little bit of time. Remember, those CU instructions are going to be in the follow-up email along with all of these resources. And then just in closing, that's it for the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Everyone here at Haas, and especially Hayden and I, are really appreciative of your support and your attendance. The follow-up email, so it will go out soon. It'll have all the questions and answers that you want, additional compliance tools, the CU credit, everything. Please utilize the contact information on the page if you have any questions at all. Our customer service team consists of seriously top-notch safety hydration experts. They've been doing this forever. And visit www.haasco.com, and you can take advantage of the live chat function to communicate with our team if you need anything. So please take what you've learned today, go forth, share this information. Remember to be champions for compliance and universal accessibility. And thank you. Please enjoy the rest of your day.